So I am really excited about this particular session and really about just what's happening in Android right now in general. Android is kind of in this transitionary period where we're moving from an imperative framework to this declarative framework, and that makes it really great for sessions like this because I have been doing Android for a few years, about 6 years, over 6 years now. And I am at the same starting place as a lot of new developers because I am learning a totally new framework and a totally new way of thinking. And so sessions like this Android Study Jam on Jetpack Compose basics is good for people like me. I have gone through this. This is how I learned a lot of my Jetpack Compose knowledge, and also really new folks because you can kind of jump in without knowing all of the history of Android to get started. This is meant to be a kind of interactive session, as interactive as you all want it. I know Madona is going to be here the whole time, and she is also an excellent and talented Android engineer, and so she can answer your questions in the chat. And I have the chat up as well, and so if you toss those out as we go through this, we will try to get all those questions answered and get you through this whole Codelab and having your first Jetpack Compose app. I think Madona is sharing the link to the Codelab, so you can go out to developer.android.com, Codelabs, and we're doing the Jetpack Compose Basics Codelab. This is meant to be kind of a code along. I have my Android Studio open. I have an emulator open. And so we're just going to work through it. If you want to work through it with me, that's awesome. And I hope you do. Getting your hands on the keyboard, I think, is a really important part of learning. If you just want to watch and come back later, definitely still feel free to ask questions. So without further ado, let's kind of jump in. So a tiny bit of history about Jetpack Compose before we do kind of get into Android Studio and really get into it. Jetpack Compose is a modern toolkit designed to simplify UI development. It combines reactive programming with conciseness and the ease of the Kotlin programming language. If you haven't used Kotlin before, it's a phenomenal language. It has made my developer life so much happier. It is fully declarative, meaning you can just describe your UI, and we'll see that a little bit later on when we jump into some of that code, by calling a series of functions that transforms your data into that UI hierarchy. When the underlying data changes, the framework will automatically re-execute the functions, updating the UI hierarchy for us. And so that's that reactive part of Jetpack Compose. A Compose app is going to be made up of composable functions, which are just regular functions marked with composable, which tells you that, which can then cause other composable functions. We do have a question in the chat. So Java is no longer needed at all. And in this particular case, the answer is 100% yes. Not only is Java no longer needed, but XML is no longer needed as well. And so we can write our apps completely in Kotlin with no additional languages at all, which is so cool. While we won't get into this, though, it can be added to apps that already exist that might have some Java already in them. They might have some Kotlin in them, and you can also just throw in Jetpack Compose as well, which is also a really great feature of Jetpack Compose. So we're going to look at making some composable functions, and by making these different kinds of functions, we can build up this whole UI library to describe our elements that's super easy to read and super easy to reuse. The prereqs for this particular Codelab are some experience with the Kotlin syntax. We won't be diving super deep into the Kotlin syntax itself, but if you have any questions about those, feel free to reach out. I think I'm helping problems there. And if you do have some Java experience, it will help a lot to just kind of like transition that knowledge over to this new language. What we're going to be doing, we're going to learn what Compose is. We've talked about it a little bit, how to build UIs with Compose, how to manage state in a composable function, how to create a performant list, how to add animations, how to style and theme an app. And so over the course of this next hour and a half, we will be building this cute little application that has an onboarding screen and a list with some animations to show us more information. To actually write Jetpack Compose code, you will need to update to the latest Android Studio or download the latest Android Studio if you don't have it, which is Arctic Fox. And there is a link in the Codelab if you haven't downloaded it already. Fair warning, setting up Android Studio can take some time if you've never done it before. All right, so let's jump in. So we're going to go ahead and start a new Compose project. Paul, I promise you will like Kotlin as well. I know Madona and I both have that same sentiment when we were getting started with Kotlin is, oh, I really like Java, but Kotlin has proven me wrong. I've never been happier with it. So we're going to start a new Jetpack Compose project. And so all we're going to do is go in, choose our Jetpack Compose activity, and get started with that. So with that, I'm kind of going to be jumping back and forth between some of this documentation and actually being hands on the keyboard inside Android Studio. So I obviously use Android Studio frequently, so I have some older projects, but I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. And actually, you can see what I was doing earlier this week is working through this Codelab to make sure I was prepared for this. So we're going to select that empty Compose activity, hit next. I'm going to go ahead and name it like the Codelab suggests. So I'm going to call it Basics Codelab. But you can really name it whatever you want. Here in our minimum SDK, we want to make sure that it's at least 21 plus. I'm going to go ahead and use API 24. And so that's going to run on about 89% of all devices. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and finish. And so my project is currently loading itself up. We see our Gradle sync in project progress. And so that is just pulling all the dependencies that we need for Jetpack Compose and building the project up so that we can see our code, interact with it, look at the different functions it has. When we choose this empty Compose activity, Android Studio is automatically going to generate a lot of things that we need, like the Android manifest, which kind of manages your different activities in your Android application, and also the build.gradle. That controls the entire app ecosystem, so it controls all your different modules. We're going to start with just one module, which is going to be our app module, and we won't add any more modules today. And so that app build Gradle is going to control your specifics of your application. And so you'll be able to see all of those different things in this project view over on the left-hand side now that it has finished loading. And so in our Gradle scripts, we see the build Gradle and the app build Gradle. We have our manifest up here. We don't really need to touch any of those, but Android Studio has generated everything we needed and given us all the different Jetpack Compose dependencies that we need as well. If you're inside the Codelab, there's also a solution to this Codelab, just in case we don't get through it all. We're definitely going to go at whatever pace you all need to go at. And so if you need to go and look at a solution eventually, not today or later today, it is available on Google's Codelab GitHub. So let's talk about getting started with Compose. So the first thing that we need to talk about is composable functions. We mentioned this a little bit in the before you begin section, and a composable function is just a regular function annotated with @composable. This enables your function to call other composable functions within it. And so in our code, we can see that there's a greeting function marked as @composable, and this function is going to produce a UI hierarchy displaying the given output string. Text itself is also a composable. And so inside our code over here, we see our composable in our app. We see the greeting, @composable annotation, a text which takes an argument and whatever name that you pass into it. Inside Compose, we're still going to use activities just like we did in older Android applications. And that activity is still going to be managed by our Android manifest. And so this is where our application is going to launch itself from, again, just like any of the other Android apps you may have written. What you might know from older Android and using XML, if you've done Android before, is that we used to call this function called setContentView. And then we passed in a layout file that was XML, often something like r.layout.mainActivity. Now, in a composable application, we instead have this setContentComposable that takes in a content of other composables as well. So here we have this basics Codelab theme, which is a way that we're going to style our composable functions. We'll circle back to this a little bit later when we hit the theming your app section of this Codelab. And then we have a surface, which comes from material and sets a color, and our greeting here. And so we also might notice that down at the bottom, we also have a different annotation. So we've talked about the @composable annotation that goes on our composable functions. And we also have this @preview annotation that's going to let us see our code, see our UI inside Android Studio. And so we will, I had this problem last night. In case you run into this problem when you're doing your own projects, if you have an older version of Java hooked up to your Android Studio, you may have to go change this preference. I specifically didn't fix it so that I would run into this and show everyone. And so you'll go up to your preferences under build execution deployment, build tools, Gradle. I can then change mine to Android 11, apply that setting, and then it should work. It's syncing again. So we will wait for that to sync, and then it should render my preview after I am able to build. So this time it shouldn't crash. But older Android used 1.8, and now we've switched to 11. So you may run into that if you already have your Android Studio set up from previous Android work. So while it works on kind of building that, with this preview, I'm able to see the code that I write live. And so it should kind of remind you of that preview that you have with XML tooling as well, is that you can either look at your XML code, or you can look at the actual UI, or you can do split view like I'm doing right here and be able to look at both the code and the UI at the same time. It's always risky to build Android Studio live because it can be hilariously slow. Madona knows. We will get there. The first time's always the roughest. So
as that loads, I just wanted to mention that I saw on Twitter this argument that with the new laptops M1, I don't know if you to it, that the build time is going to be pretty fast. So maybe that is something we need to lobby.
I know. Someone convince my boss.
Yeah, somebody
tell them I need it for the Codelabs.
That's what I was thinking too. Like, look, we might need this because I
know.
To be fair, I got the M1 when I went to buy my laptop, and it's pretty fast. It does not also like heat up like my other work laptop. So
how will I keep my hands warm in the wintertime if Android Studio is not doing it for me?
Well, you need a fireplace.
It's almost there. It's thinking so hard about it. So we see my default preview thinking really hard about it. And we have action. We see our preview. So we see our greeting. We passed in Android. And so we have this little default preview that is a text view or a text composable that says, hello, Android, ! So we can move on. So the next step that we're going to kind of talk about is how we're going to tweak this UI to kind of meet some of our different needs. How are we going to customize it so that we're not just stuck with these default composables? So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to set a different color for our greeting text. And we're going to do this by using the surface composable. We already saw this surface composable up inside our theme, and then we have a surface. So now let's also write our text, wrap our text in a surface as well. And so we'll type in our surface. And we'll go ahead and set our text as the content for that surface, and we'll pass in a new color. And so we'll have set our color variable equal to the material theme dot colors dot primary color. So now all my errors go away. Let's see if this build is quicker. Fingers crossed, everyone, or else this is going to be a very slow Codelab. The component is now nested inside our surface. And so you should also have seen this preview is out of date and that you have to build and refresh. And when you see that refresh happens, we should now have a different material theme in our different color in the background of our greeting. And so now we see that the primary color out of the box for Android applications when you start it from Android Studio is this beautiful purple color. And so now our default preview has that purple background in our Hello Android text. What you might not have noticed immediately out of the box is that our Android text color also automatically changed. Before it was like a blackish color on a white background, and now we changed the background to purple and our text is now white. And we didn't actually set that anywhere, so that's a really cool thing that kind of happens when you use some of these material design components. Surface, again, is an example of a material design component, and these are built to give developers make it easier for developers to build an experience with common features that users expect. And it can do things like choose appropriate colors for your text. We say that material is an opinionated framework because it provides good defaults and patterns that are common to most applications. And the material components in Compose are built on top of these foundational composables that you can find at androidx.compose.foundation, which are also accessible from your app, which means that if you need more customization or something more flexibility, you can use those basic composables instead of the material composables. In this case, Surface understands that when you change your background color to the primary color, it needs to also change your text color to an on-primary color. And in this case, on-primary is going to be this white color. Throughout this Codelab, they're going to have a lot of really useful links to kind of dig deeper into some of these topics. And so this is actually the first one, if you're following along in the actual document, in the actual Codelab, is that there's a whole list of all the different Compose material catalog that are available to you in your application. So that was a really cool change, but what if we want to make more changes? For example, what if we want to add padding to our text composable? In Jetpack Compose, we use modifiers to access a lot of those XML attributes that you used to be able to add onto your different views. So things like padding, behaviors, adding on-click listeners, those are the types of things that we can do through the modifier. In this example, we want to go ahead and add padding around our text so that it takes up a little bit more room. And so we'll do this by using a modifier with the padding function. And so here in our text, we'll add a comma, and we'll do modifier, use the name variable modifier, and then modifier dot padding. Woo. And so I want to add 24 dp of padding to my composable, and I'll just have to import that. And it's not going to tell me to refresh it. Let's build it again. I'll let that run. So one word of warning when you're pulling in a lot of these composable functions, and you'll see this throughout this Codelab, is that there's a lot of things that are named really similarly or the same as older Android functions as well. And so you have to be really careful about pulling in the correct compose functions. And so they make a note earlier in this presentation, in this Codelab, that you want to pull in things from this Android X compose.ui and this Android X compose.foundation. So just as you think about this and might work on things in your own time, it can be really frustrating when you get the red lines, even though it looks like you're doing the same thing as the Codelab. Just make sure you double check your imports and you are in fact importing the right thing. So when we refresh this, we should see something that looks a little bit like this. Just a bigger, just that 24 dp of padding on our, and the background color is still purple for the whole thing. My computer is definitely struggling with building and sharing and being on a meeting at the same time. So we're going to go ahead and keep moving on and try to let it catch up as we go. Since this Codelab has a lot of examples of what you should be expecting, hopefully yours is building a little bit quicker than mine is. So the next section of this Codelab is going to be about reusing your composables. As you kind of build out these different UIs, you can build some really complex and beautiful UIs using Jetpack Compose, and it's going to be a lot quicker than using XML and custom views and all these things. And that's a really big perk of using Jetpack Compose, is it makes it so much easier to build these beautiful and complex UIs. But as you kind of do this inside your application, it could affect the readability as your functions become very large and lots of different nested composables inside of them. By making small reusable components, it's going to be a lot easier to build up a library of UI elements that you can use throughout your application. Each different composable function is going to be responsible for one small part of the screen and can be edited independently. So now we see it finally did build, and we do see that padding on all sides. So the next thing, if we look at what we currently have, we see that in both our main activity, in our onCreate, we have this surface and greeting, and we also have our greeting down in our preview. And so what we're going to do is create a smaller reusable component called My App. And that's going to be able to be reused in several different places so that we can update both our actual app that we could run on a phone and the preview that we're looking at in Android Studio, so that both of them update at the same time and we can trust what is being shown. And so all we're going to do is pull out this surface and our greeting and put it inside My App. And so since we now have that new function, we can replace that code up here with My App. And we'll go ahead and replace it in the default preview with My App as well. And so now you can check your code against the example code in the Codelab to make sure that you're all caught up. This time it did let me know that I could refresh and build, but it should look exactly the same. So with that, let's jump in and talk about some basic building blocks of building your app with Jetpack Compose. So we have now gone through the reusable composables. We made our app. And so now we're jumping into creating rows and columns. If you've worked with Android in the past, you may have learned at the very beginning about a layout called linear layout. With linear layouts in a lot of nesting, you can build some really complex UIs because all linear layouts do will either put things in a row or put things in a column using XML. And so you could build almost anything out using this basic building block of XML and the view hierarchy. In Jetpack Compose, we can use the column composable, the row composable, and the box composable to do a lot of the same things. Column, row, and box are composable functions that take composable content, so other composable functions, so you can place items inside. So for example, each child inside column will be placed vertically inside your column. And so this example of column, text first row, text second row, will have two texts on top of each other, first row, second row. And so now we're going to try to use a column composable to change our greeting composable function so that it shows a column with two text elements like this in the example. And they make a quick note for us that we might have to move some padding around. So instead of looking at the code, let's jump in and think about how we might be able to do that. So inside our greeting, we have the surface. We want to keep that surface because we still want the background to be that purple color. We just saw that in the end result of what we should be doing. But we're going to want to add a column inside that surface. And so inside, we're going to have two texts. One is going to say hello. So we can add that here. Hello. Or I guess we should capitalize it. Hello. And it has a comma. And the second text, I will name it text to stay consistent. Text is going to be our name. We'll leave name hard-coded. So now we can go ahead and get rid of this. Now, if we run this right now, it's going to take that background and shrink it around our hello name, which would be hello Android in this case. And so we want to add that padding to the whole column instead of individual texts composables inside the column. And so now we're going to take that modifier and put it on the column itself and do modifier padding and do 24 dp. And so all we did was lift that off the single text composable onto the column that's going to wrap around our 2 text composables. And now we can build and refresh again. So if you look at the code and compare yours to the solution, compare what we just did to our solution, we see that we got the same thing out, which is really awesome. I will note that with this kind of thing, there are different ways to do the same thing. So if your solution doesn't match theirs, that could be okay. Lots of different ways to come to the same solution. That's a really great thing about programming, or a really fun thing about programming, is we all think in slightly different ways. And so we see here, we're successful. We have our hello Android preview, just like what we were hoping would show up. So now we're going to jump into some really cool features of Kotlin. And because Compose is written in Kotlin, we can take advantage of those really cool things. Composable functions, again, are functions just like every other function in Kotlin, which means that we can build really powerful UIs because we can add if statements and loops and these sorts of things, and those will affect how our UI is displayed. So one example of that we can do is inside my app, we can now replace this with a column. And inside that column, we're not going to add any modifiers for this. We're going to have just a quick for loop that's going to loop through a list of names. So let's give our function a list of names as an input. So we'll have names, and that will just be a list of strings. And so that we don't have to pass any of this in just yet, we're going to go ahead and add a default value for that list of strings. And so we'll pass in a list of world and compose, our favorite word of the day. And so this means that up here in our basic Codelab theme and down in our preview, we don't have to actually pass in a different list. Since we don't pass anything in, it will use this default list of world and compose instead. And so now we can use these features of Kotlin now that we have a list to loop through, and we can do for name and in names. We just write a very simple for loop, and now we can call our greeting function and say name. So let's go ahead and build and refresh. Build and refresh is going to be said several times throughout this presentation. And as it does that, we're also going to look at some of the different preview arguments you can also have. Right now, we have this show background equals true. And so we haven't talked at all about what kind of size this is. So we see our preview. I know that. We see our preview of what we just added. And so now we have those 2 different blocks of code or blocks of UI. We have hello world and hello compose that we got through that for loop. So next, we want to come down to our preview and we want to add some dimensions. And so we're going to add a dimension on the average Android phone. And so we're going to add in 320. And so we see that this is with DP. And so it's assuming that we are asking it to create a 320 preview. Wait for my zoom level. So if I zoom out, I see that these are all on one side, but my full 320 DP screen is still mostly empty. And so if we jump back over and look at what we're going to do next, we're going to take what we have now. We have exactly this hello world stacked right on top of hello compose wrapping around the content and not filling up the space. And we're going to try to make it look like this. And so we're going to add some space around it. We're going to make it fill what we have, and we're going to make it look a little bit nicer. And so here we're going to try to replicate this using both fill max width and the padding modifier. So we're learning about a new modifier we haven't seen yet. So let's jump in and try. So the first thing that I want to do is that I know I need those columns to fill up the max width, and they gave us this hint that we should be using fill max width. And so here on my column, I'm going to add a new modifier and use fill max width, and then leave my padding of 24. And so if I go ahead and build and refresh that, we should see it update. Fill max width, again, I'm just going to keep talking about older Android to kind of help, because that helped me a lot when I was learning some Jetpack Compose, is thinking about what I was doing and what I'm doing now. Fill max width should remind you a lot of setting your layout width in your XML to match the parent size. So that just fills up everything that you have there. And so now our entire background is filled with this purple. The next thing that we're going to kind of think about is some of those gaps. So we want both hello world to have some gaps on the end, and to have some gaps on the top and the bottom, and some gaps between. And so we can do that with adding padding to the right places. So we want to go ahead and add a modifier to the column in my app to make sure that we add that padding on the top and bottom. And so here we can do modifier equal modifier dot padding. And so what we haven't talked about is that we actually have a lot of different padding options when we start typing in padding. So far, we have only used this top one, which applies our padding to all 4 sides of our composable. But there's also ones that has start, top, bottom, end, and also one that just has horizontal and vertical. Since we want to do it on both the top and the bottom, we can use this vertical, and set that to just a 4.dp. We can keep building it out. While that runs. And so that's going to push down the top and the bottom just a little bit. Now we want to add that gap in between and add some padding on the different sides. And so now we see, oh, there's a little gap, and there's a little gap at the bottom as well. And so now let's push in the composable from either end and push it up in the middle. And so here we're going to change our surface because we want to see some gaps between the different purple sections. And so we already have our color passed in. And so now we're also going to add a modifier. What you might notice while we're doing this is that pretty much every composable does have the modifier available so that you can customize it as you see fit. And this is actually a really good practice to get into when you're building your own composables, is passing in that modifier so that you can also modify your different reusable components as well. And so now we see that we have padding all the way around, in between, and the top and bottom, which is awesome. So some things that we learned while we were doing this is that modifiers have overloads. So for example, we use the vertical and horizontal on this particular example, but we could also specify all the sides of our composable, or we can specify just one side by using top, bottom, start, or end. And that we can chain together multiple modifiers to create an element that has different things applied to it. So for this one, we used modifier next with in, and whereas on the other ones, all we did was add padding. So if we jump back over, we see that we have now achieved this default preview that we were expecting. And so again, they have code here in case you need it. The final thing that we're going to do in this particular section is adding a button to our screen. And so now we have our hello world, hello compose, text on one side. And so we're going to add the show more on the other side. Again, like a lot of things that we've talked about, button is also a composable that's going to be provided to us by the material package. And it's going to take in a composable, again, a content as the last argument. And so quick example of kind of what that's going to look like. We're going to have this button. It's going to have an on click inside as an argument. And then again, you see those trailing lambdas or the trailing braces. That's our trailing lambda function. And that's going to be the content or another composable that's going to fill in our button. There are a lot of different buttons that you can use that are already styled for you, which is awesome. And so we have things like an outlined button, a text button. We'll also talk about later an icon button. So there are a lot of buttons, and you just have to find which one is the right one for your particular use case. In this example, we're going to be using the outlined button. So let's go over again and jump in and look at our code. So,
hey, Sierra, you have a question?
What is it?
Yeah, I felt like you can address this one because it's okay. I felt like you can address this because it's a pretty cool question. So the question is, why not pad fast, then fill max width instead of the other way around?
So they get applied in the order that you call them. So let's just try it out and see what happens. I would also just quickly note that, again, we already kind of mentioned this, particularly with like padding and with the modifiers. You can chain them in a lot of different ways to give you your outcome. And so you might find a different way that makes more sense to you than what this Codelab shows. And so we see in this particular example, it really doesn't matter. There are definitely examples where chaining them is going to give you the result that you want. And so kind of learning how to think about what's happening in what order is going to be an important part about thinking about building applications in Jetpack Compose. So for this particular answer, my answer is because I was building it off the Google Codelab and wanted to make sure that the answer that I'm showing you matches, but there are many orders that you can put this in to give you your final result. Thanks, Madona, for calling out that I have a question. I was definitely in the zone adding buttons. Okay, so quick reminder after that is that we're adding the show more button and we're using an outlined button from the material package. From, again, classic XML Android, you know that when you kind of want to put something at one end, we have these XML attributes like align end, align on the baseline. We don't have those in Jetpack Compose, but we do still have wait, and we can use wait to kind of tell it how these different elements should fill up our screen. We also had wait in XML, and I most commonly use those when kind of trying to space things out inside a linear layout. So it definitely makes sense for me that I'm going to be using waits to space things out correctly in a column, because I think about columns as really similar to a vertical linear layout. So here we're going to go ahead. So to put this in, we have this column, and that's going to have our hello and world and hello and compose, hello and whatever name. And then now we need to think about it as a row and have our two texts on one end and our button on the other. And so we are going to go ahead and add into our surface now also a row. And we will have to import that. And so again, I want to make sure that I import from the Compose UI to get that row. So now I have a row and I can add different things to it. So first I have my column, and now I want to add my outlined button. And you see we automatically get the on click. I broke them up. No, I need that. On click. And then we have this trailing lambda, which is going to take in our content. Now, let's show more. So we can add a text composable with the text show more. Refresh. We kind of know what's going to happen is because we haven't added that wait that we just talked about. It's going to be hello world button, hello compose button, and we need those to be spaced out. So to do that, we can now add a wait to our column modifier. And by setting that wait, it's going to say this should take up all the room we have. I didn't do something right. Yikes. I don't know where my button is. Let me think about it. Where did the button go? I'll come back to it. So let's go ahead and do that. So inside our column, we're going to replace some of these modifiers with what we actually need. Oh, I know why. Because I still have this fill max width, it's pushing my button completely off. I need to change this first before I am able to build that and see it, because it is legitimately taking up all of the width we have. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. The joys of live coding in front of an audience. And instead, let's replace that with our modifier dot wait. And so we'll go ahead and put 1 because we want that to take up all the room we have. We still want this particular composable to keep that 24 padding around. So now we're going to apply that up a level and apply that to the row instead of the column. And so now we're going to add a modifier to our row. Adding, and we'll again do 24.dp. And let's refresh and build and see if I forgot anything else while I'm presenting. Well, making sure. Let's try. Woohoo! Awesome. So if we jump back over, success. We have our hello world on the left side and our show more button on the right side. And our code looks suspiciously like the solution here. It's almost like I practiced. So let's go ahead and go to our next section. This section is really important, and this is going to be about our state and compose. And so in this section, we're going to add some interactions to our screen. So far, we've created this static layout, and so now we actually want that button to do something. And so before we get into how to make that button clickable, although my guess is that you might have a guess already, given the name of some variables we've already looked at, we'll need to store that value somewhere to indicate whether or not each item is expanded or not. This might at first seem like very simple. We know how to store a variable. It could be very easy to add a variable like var expand it equals false. And then inside our on click, just switch around that variable. Expand it equals not expand it. But this isn't expand it. But this won't work for us. And the reason that won't work for us is because Jetpack Compose isn't going to know that it needs to update that UI if we change this variable, expand it. Compose is going to transform our data in the UI by recalling our composable functions. And so if our data changes, Compose re-executes all the functions with this new data, creating an updated UI. And this process is going to be called recomposition. In order to make recomposition happen, we need to use state variables, and those state variables are something that Jetpack Compose knows it needs to subscribe to and listen to changes. Well, that will then update your UI. Again, really great links throughout this Codelab to start digging deeper into some of these topics, because we are staying very high level throughout this. And so now we might say, okay, well, we know how to add a state variable in Jetpack Compose. We have this other function called mutable state of. And so we can just wrap false in a yelling at. The reason for that is, yes, we can set it to mutable state of, and now expanded is a state, but it means that and it will re-trigger this function to be recomposed when it changes, but it will always be getting reset. And so when greeting re-executes, recomposition happens, expand it will then be set back to mutable state of false. And so the value of expand it is never going to be remembered. And so the next step is wrapping this mutable state of inside this remember function. And so that's actually what it's going to be yelling at us for if you look at that error message. We're using it without remember. And so now we're going to do remember. And remember is actually also a composable, which I think is a really cool reminder that compose is not just, I spelled it wrong. Remember. And we'll go ahead and import that. And so, like I said, if we clicked into remember, we see that it is also a composable function. And so I think it's really cool and a good reminder that not all composables are just like our UI elements, although that's what we're going to talk about today. A lot of these other functions that we're using inside our composables are also other composable functions that don't immediately represent UI elements. And so now we have this doesn't know how to do not expand it. And so instead, we're actually going to want to do expand it dot value equals not expand it dot value. And then it's also yelling at me up here because I was using var to show you the other variable, but since it is a mutable state of, and we're only changing the value inside that state, is we can actually use a value, and values won't ever change. And so now we can again refresh and build, although we did not change the actual UI. And so we've set up this expand it on click. So our expand it changes back and forth, but our expand it variable doesn't do anything for our UI right now. And so what we want it to do is when it's expanded, we want our button to now say show less. And when it's collapsed, we want that button to say show more. And so what we can do is inside our text, we can add a quick if-else statement and say if expand it dot value. If expand it dot value. Oh, he's saying expand it dot value. Let's show less. Else. Show more. And now all of our errors are gone. And so now we're actually going to run this app on an emulator. And so I have my emulator already set up. If you haven't created an emulator before, you'll want to use this little AVD manager, and it will have a wizard to help take you through setting up your first emulator and downloading the Android operating system, which Android phone you want to be using, and all of these cool customizations that you might want to be doing. So I'm going to go ahead and play that, and it will probably take just a couple of minutes.
Oh, it felt like you were muted a bit there if you were talking.
Thank you for letting me know. I was just saying that I am going to run it on an actual emulator now.
We can't hear you, right? Right? Can people say in this chat if they can hear Sierra?
Yeah, please
maybe
let
it's
me
just
know.
me. Let me see. Oh, okay, cool.
Good. Okay, cool.
Okay, maybe it's my side. Let me see what's happening.
Well, Madona checks that out. My app has supposedly run. Yeah, there we go. Everything's just a little bit slower when I'm trying to share. So now we see it on an actual emulator. And so now I can see show more, show less, show more, show less. We haven't added that expansion yet, but we do see that our state variable is actually working because we can see our text flipping back and forth as we click that button. And so that on click is working to update the state variable. Composing our composable so that it is updating the text. So let's jump back in and let's actually make it expand. And so what we're going to do is add a new value inside our composable. It's going to be val extra padding. And we're going to set that equal again to a little if else statement. If expand it dot value. We'll set it to 48. So we'll add 48 dp of padding if it's expanded. Else, we'll just set that extra padding to 0 because it's not expanded. And we're just going to go ahead and apply that to our composable function on the bottom of our row. And so, or inside our column to match their answer. And so we already have our weight. And so what we'll do is then add dot padding. And now we'll use that very specific padding and just say we want to add it to the bottom and do that as extra padding. So we'll use our variable. And so if we want to rerun our app again, we should be able to see that expand and collapse as we push that button. So we'll go ahead and terminate the last version. And wait for it to find its way to the screen. So now if we do show more, oh, our extra 48 dp of padding. Show less. So that's pretty awesome. Okay, so now we kind of know what a state variable is and we know what remember does. And this lets us set that state inside this given composable so that we can control how big our greeting composable gets as we click that button and also what text is being displayed. So now we're going to move on to section 8, which is on state hoisting. In Compose functions, state that is read or modified by multiple functions should live in a common ancestor. And this process is called state hoisting, which means lifting that state out of individual composable to that shared ancestor. What we just did was create a state that just lived inside of each individual greetings and is tied directly to that greeting and nothing else modifies it. So it's just going to live there. In this example, we're now going to create this onboarding screen that says welcome to the basics Codelab and the continue button. And so we'll go ahead and add that to our main activity. So let's jump back over to our code. You can pull up what you're kind of expecting, so you can try to build it out yourself. And so I'm going to add it right under my app and add @composable. We know we need our @composable annotation. We're at a function called the onboarding screen. And we'll have a surface. I don't know why it really wants to bring in that whole thing. And inside that surface, we have both the text and the button. So we're going to add a column to stack those things on top of each other. And so we'll have a text that says, welcome to the basics Codelab, exclamation point, because it's so exciting. And then we'll also have a button. And so we have an on click and our content. And so our button was just going to say continue. So we'll go ahead and add that, continue. And then we'll do a little bit of styling. So we're going to talk about a couple new attributes on our column. So first we'll add a modifier. And this time we'll use fill max size. So this is like setting both the height and the width to match parent if you were thinking about XML Android. And so that would take up the whole screen. And then we'll add this vertical, I'm really bad at spelling, vertical arrangement. And we'll say arrangement.center, which is going to center our content inside our space vertically. So that will put it right in the middle of our screen. And then we'll also have a horizontal maybe. Oh, I see. That's why it's mad at me. Horizontal alignment. And we'll do alignment center horizontally. And so that's going to center our information in the center of the screen horizontally. So one is going to push it to the center vertically and the other horizontally. And so that will leave us right in the middle of the screen. We'll make our button a little bit, we'll modify our button a little bit. So on our button, we will also add, oops, don't want to do whatever I just did. In addition to our on-click, we will add a modifier. Close modifier dot padding. So we'll just add a little bit of padding to the vertical so that they're not right on top of each other. And so we'll add 24.dp of padding there. And then the only thing we have left is adding an on-click. And so let's create a new variable, var should show onboarding. And this time we're going to use this by delegate instead of setting it equal, which is just a little syntactic sugar from Kotlin. So we'll say by remember mutable state of. Oh, everyone gets to see how bad I am at spelling live. Remember. And so it probably will yell at you. And it will ask you to import get value of mutable state of if you use this by delegate. And so I will go ahead and do that. And now it is supposed to be happy. Okay, bring that one in too. And now once I got all my imports for getting and setting values for mutable state of, we're good to go there, and it stops yelling at me. The nice thing about using this by delegate instead of setting something equal to remember mutable state of is that now we actually have the value itself. And so you notice here, we no longer have that val. We were using val when we talked about mutable state of the first time. This time we're going to use var because this should show onboarding is actually that value that's stuck inside mutable state of, and that's something that we actually do want to be able to change. And so now in our onClick, instead of doing that should show onboarding dot value, we can just do should show onboarding equals false. So once we see it once, we don't have to do it again. And we, again, don't have to do dot value there. And now we're going to add a second preview. So we have our preview that we have from our first screen. And so we can do an @preview a second time. And we'll again add should show background set to true. We'll keep that width, and we'll add a height DP this time of 320 as well. We'll add our @composable because our preview is also composable, and we'll add a function called onboarding preview. We'll also wrap that in our basics Codelab theme. And we don't need that. And then we'll put in our onboarding screen. Ooh, I forgot a G. Onboarding preview. Onboarding preview screen. All right. Now if we refresh, we see our default preview matching this, and we see that it knows it's going to be making an onboarding preview as well. Android Studio really doesn't like the word onboarding. It always thinks that it is a typo. That's a problem I face in my own project because we also have onboarding screens, as do most applications. So we haven't actually done anything with state hoisting. We still now have these two different functions that both have state inside of them. And now we see our onboarding preview is also there, and we have that continue button. So we want to add this onboarding screen before you're able to see your list. And so to do that, we have the ability that we have in XML where we set change the visibility of different elements to hide them and show them on our screen, where we can set things to visible, invisible, or gone, depending on our requirements. Instead, in Compose, we have all the features of Kotlin, which means that we just use if-else statements or just if statements to hide and show things. And so what our kind of end goal is going to be is inside my application is we're going to have if should show onboarding. Then we want to show our onboarding screen. Else, if we don't want to show onboarding, we can just go ahead and show the column that we've already built. So we see that's already yelling at us because we don't know where that should show onboarding is going to be coming from. So with staying with best practices for Jetpack Compose, we're going to go ahead and pull out our column into its own function. So down here, we're going to go ahead and add another composable function. We're writing a lot of them today, and add composable function. We'll call this one greetings. And we'll put this down here. And we'll come up here, snag our column, get rid of that, and put it inside our new greetings function. It doesn't know what names is, but we know what names is. So we'll actually take that out of my app because it doesn't need to be there anymore. And we'll add that as the arguments and default argument of our greetings. And so now greetings is happy. And so we can go back up, and instead of doing all that inside the my app, we can go ahead and just add if should show onboarding, still yelling at us for that onboarding screen. And then otherwise, we'll just show the greetings. So now we're actually going to hoist that state variable out of the onboarding screen, because now it applies to both the onboarding screen and the greetings, because it's going to control the visibility of those different composables. So let's go ahead and take that out of onboarding screen and put it in my app. Now, my app is happy. It knows what all its variables are. They're state variables. They'll automatically recompose for us. But onboarding screen is now upset because it needs to toggle that should show onboarding when you click that continue button. And so how we're going to do that is, instead of passing around state variables, because we already said that we want to hoist those up and keep them in that ancestor, and that gives us a single source of truth, so that lots of things aren't modifying those throughout the different composables that depend on them. And so instead, we're going to be able to add in a new argument to our onboarding screen. And so we're going to add in a parameter called onContinueClicked. And this is going to be a function. So it will if you haven't seen functions used in this way before, in Kotlin, we're going to use callbacks. And so we'll create this callback on onContinueClicked that we've already written. And this empty parentheses means that this function is not going to take any variables in. So it's a function that does not have arguments. And this unit on this slide means that it's not going to have a return type. And so up in our, and so now instead of actually calling a function on our onClick, we will call our onClick callback. And so here we'll have onContinueClicked instead. And we just looked at what we want that function to do. And so we're able to pass that in our my app when we call this onboarding. And so up here, we'll have our onContinueClicked. And all we want that to do is should show onboarding equals false. And so as we do that, you also might notice that now our bar is no longer highlighted, because now we are actually changing that. And so it does need to actually be a var, so it stops yelling at us about that. And our onboarding screen is now stateless. It doesn't have any state variables. And so now we can again Oh, I know. Let's go ahead and add a default parameter for this. And so we're just going to add an empty function in our preview while that builds. I know. We'll go ahead and do that. It was upset because I didn't pass anything in there. So we can jump over to our app, which is still building. Woo! It's coming up. It's trying so hard. And so now we see, welcome to the Basics Codelab. Our button continues. So our onboarding screen is chef kiss perfect. And now if we push continue, we now enter our application. That onboarding screen is gone. Our My App recomposed and ran through recomposition. It re-executed that function. And now we see hello world, show more, hello compose, show more, and that still works. So our state hoisting is complete and working, and it can share between those two different screens so that it controls the entire kind of application. Okay, awesome. So something that now our preview is kind of interesting. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do, so if we jump back over to the Codelab, we have now finished our state hoisting section. We are experts at state hoisting. We know exactly what the best practices are to pull that state up to the ancestor. And so we're going to move on to creating a performant list. So what we're going to do is right now we only have two things in our list. We have welcome and compose. And so now we're going to create this list, and it's going to be 1,000 entries long. And each one is just going to be a number that's a string. And so if we jump back over into our code, instead of saying list of hello world compose, we're going to do list, and that's going to be 1,000 long. And the function that we're going to use to generate those 1,000 entries is just going to be a string. That's it. Okay. So we could run this code, and it gives you the warning. And so I'm not, because my application is already struggling when I'm just writing regular things, is that it might freeze. Because what's going to happen is it's going to generate and emit every single composable that it needs to create this 1,000 composable list of greetings. And so, as I'm sure you can guess, I mean, we already saw it on our screen. At most, that can probably fit 8. And so it's going to generate another 990 other composables that we can't even see. And so that doesn't make sense. If you've used Android before, always my phrase of the day, if you've used Android before, you might immediately kind of know what kind of view you would use in this particular scenario. Recycler view, replace list view to kind of make it performant. And so what recycler view does is it recycles the views on your screen and keeps updating them with new information. In Compose, we're going to use something called lazy column, and there's also a lazy row that does the same thing. And that emits those views on the screen and then keeps emitting them as you scroll. And so it's just emitting the views that you need to actually see your UI. And so what we're going to do is inside our greetings, where we just changed it from 1,000, from 2 entries to 1,000, instead of using this column, we'll go ahead and comment that out as we work through this. We're going to use lazy column. And go ahead and import that and make sure we import the correct one. So I'll pull the same modifier because we still want that modifier. We still want it to look the same. We just want it to act a little different. And inside that lazy column, we're going to use this items function. This is where they tell you in the Codelab specifically, like, make sure you pull in the right one or else you will get weird lines, even though it looks exactly the same. So we're going to pull in this items that has the list, and we're going to pass in our list. So we'll pick that one, and we'll pass in our names. inside our lazy item scope, we can access each name as it generates. So we'll have our name variable. And then for each name in our lazy column list of items, we're going to call not greeting, but greeting singular, and pass in that name equals name. Woohoo! And so I am also going to quickly change this to greetings so that our we have both the greetings and the onboarding screen separately, because right now our default preview shows the welcome to Basics Codelab instead of the actual list. While it's doing that, we can also go ahead and run that on our actual emulator so that we can see it happening on a real phone device. Yeah, terminate. To answer your question, Madonna, you almost have to be this patient. You have to use Android Studio a lot. After this many years, I've definitely learned what I should be spending my time doing while I have things building. So that's still the old one. It's working its way through. I'm going to go ahead and delete my old composable and watch it render slowly. Ooh, so fun. All right, while we're doing that, we're going to go ahead and show all 6. That's so many things it's doing. I'm going to just cancel all these and see if that will fix some of my problems. Ooh, there we go. Look at that. We have a list. Amazing. I'm not sure all the things it's doing. I'm trying really hard to let this computer do all the things. While that's happening, let me go ahead and run on the emulator. But we do see kind of the moral of that story is that we see our lists and we see all the hello, comma, numbers and all of our show more. I really like this to come up. So the next section that we're going to jump into is persisting our state. So if we look at our application, if it finishes and we push continue, then yes, we see our whole list and we can see all the different things as we scroll through, which is awesome. But what we might notice is if I go ahead and turn my emulator, maybe. Oh no, we see our welcome to the Basics Codelab again. And so if I go back and now I want to rotate back and try to rotate again, I am going to keep seeing that welcome to the Basics Codelab, even though we've already hit continue. And that's because the remember function can remember as long as the composable is kept in the composition. And when we do things like rotate, we're actually causing configuration changes that causes the entire activity, which we haven't talked about our activity very much at all, to restart. And so everything inside of it is lost. And so that variable is set back to false and we have to see it again. It happens when we rotate like this. It happens if we changed our app from dark mode to light mode. It would happen if you have a process death as well. And so what we can do instead of using this remember up in our onboarding screen is instead use remember savable. And so we will have to import that as well. And so by switching out that remember to remember savable, that will remember that variable between these kind of configuration changes, rotations, changing to dark mode, killing the process. And so running this again, we should no longer see that onboarding screen when we kind of do that rotation. things in kind of the last 15 minutes, and I might go a little bit faster to kind of get through some of those different things. But I'd like to stop right here and just call out that with about 120 lines of code, we have made this list. It has 1,000 things in it. We have an onboarding screen that disappears and doesn't come back without killing the entire application. And so this right here is kind of where what I see is the real basics of Jetpack Compose kind of stop. And now we'll do just some cool things that you can do to kind of let you know that you can. And so having done that, if I push continue, we can see that this should work. Hopefully. So slow, the suspense is killing me. And so see, we did not see that onboarding screen this time. So if I rotate it back, bingo, bingo, bongo, we don't see that onboarding screen. And so that remember savable did 100% get us what we want. So with that, we're going to move into some of these cool animations and styling and cool things that you can do. And so we're just going to kind of talk through all of those a little bit quicker so we can get through the end. So the next thing that we want to do is actually animate. If we jump back in here, this is a pretty intense, just there, not there, there, not there. It's not a smooth transition. And so Jetpack Compose is going to give us some really nice animations that's going to make those things much prettier. And so here in our greeting composable, we are going to use this animate DP as state, which is going to take a target value and do an animation to make it smoother as you change that DP. And so instead of having extra padding equal to this if else, we are going to do extra padding by animate as state, animate DP as state. And so our target value is still going to be the same if else, because our target value, if it's expanding, is 48. And if it's not expanding, if it's collapsing, it's 0. And we can go ahead and just set that as target value. If we ran this again, then you would see that animation. Something to know about all these different animate something, we're using animate DP as state, is that they are all cancelable and restartable. And so you can click these buttons really, really fast and still see them kind of working. So in this case, if I continue and then expand one of my different hello worlds, we can see it's a much cleaner transition. It looks a lot nicer. We see that expansion and collapse, and they look much better. We have only passed in the target value, which is a required argument for this particular function, but you can also customize it in some really cool ways. And so it also has, if you click into animate as state and look at kind of what you have here, you have this animation spec. And so that can give you some different options to tell it how it should animate. So let's go ahead and add an animation spec. And we're going to use something called Spring. And so it's going to behave like a spring. And so if you've done any physics, I have a background in physics, so I think this is really cool. You can set those variables that you might have studied in a physics class somewhere along the way. And so we can do a ratio, a damping ratio equal to spring.damping. Yeah, I know I spelled damping wrong. Damping ratio, spring.damping ratio medium bouncy, and stiffness equal to spring.stiffness low. So let's go ahead and again rebuild that. There's some other different ones that you can pass into this animation spec that are kind of cool to play with. We're using this spring, but there's also something called tween and repeatable that you can play with and decide which one you like the best. As we wait for that to kind of build, there's also this finish listener, which is kind of cool, is that when that animation finishes, you can tell it to do something. So if you wanted to expand and then change colors, you could add that into that finish listener. And so if we go back to our application, continue, and now if we watch it, it does a little bounce. One thing that we do have to add is that this could potentially padding to go to a negative padding, which would cause our application to crash. And so instead, we want to add a coerce. We want to force our padding to be greater than 0. So we'll add coerce at least 0.dp to protect it against potentially crashing. And so with that, I wanted to do that before I let that crash. Our animation kind of section is done. And so the next thing that we're going to talk about is what that styles file looks like. So at the beginning, we said we'll talk about that later, and later has now come. So if I continue, now that I have that spring, you see the little bounce. And as we click it really quickly, it doesn't look as natural when I'm doing this because my computer is being a little laggy, but that restart, canceling the animation and restarting it looks really natural when you use this kind of spring animation if you're not sharing your screen and trying to do all these things at the same time. So I would definitely recommend kind of checking that out on your own time. That's one thing I really like about Jetpack Compose is that it makes some of these things that used to be like totally, I would never do them, like add these really cute little animations to make my app feel a little bit more natural. They make them really easy, like adding that animation was so easy. And so that just makes your app feel better for your users. And it doesn't take too much time for you as a developer. So let's go ahead and quickly look at our theming, just to kind of understand what we can do with theming. So if we jump back out to our Codelab, we're now on style and theming. So we've made it all the way to section 12. And so they tell us to go ahead, check out our theming file, and we'll just kind of look through it because we're running pretty low on time. Didn't factor in enough time to also wait for previews and builds. And so what we see here is that this basic Codelab that we have wrapped our entire application in is just this quick if-else check that checks whether or not we're in a dark theme. And then it emits this material theme that has colors, it has typography, it has shapes, and then the final is our content. And so that's what we have been passing in from our main application is we pass our whole content of our app into this basic Codelab theme, which then passes it into this material theme. And what that material theme does is it's going to style our entire application using, again, these material themes that are built out to make it easier for developers to style their application. And we see within here that we have this dark color theme and this light color palette. And so we're able to quickly change these sorts of things to flip in between those. And so if you're following along the Codelab, you'll see that they tell you to add some new colors to your colors file. So you'll go into color.kotlin and add those new colors in here. And then you'll be able to jump back into your theme, switch out these palettes to this blue theme that they suggest using. And you're able to, by setting your light palette to these new themes, so adding this navy, light blue, blue, and chartreuse to your colors.kotlin, and then switching them out inside the color palette, you'll immediately see your preview. After rebuilding, you'll see that your preview updates to these nice colors. The next thing that they mention is more things that we can add to our preview annotation to have a more robust preview inside Android Studio without rebuilding our application at all. And so we see that they add this UI mode, and it says UI mode yes. And so if after changing those colors and updating our preview, we'll now get 3 previews in our preview tab. We'll see our onboarding screen, which will also be updated using our new colors, because again, that material theme is going to trickle down to all of our parts of our app because we're wrapping our whole content and putting it inside that material theme. And then we'll be able to see a dark theme and a default preview. And so the takeaway from here is that we updated our light theme, but we also need to update our dark theme. And so we'll also go in, update our dark theme material palette, same color, blue. Maybe our primary is going to be navy, and our unprimary will be this chartreuse. And so then going back, looking at our preview again, we will be able to see a dark theme and a light theme that are styled in a really similar way using this new color palette that we very quickly were able to add and apply to our entire application. If you've done Android development in the past, you probably also, again, know that doing those kinds of things and theming your app across an entire app can be like a very tedious and time-consuming and sometimes painful and challenging process. Other things that you get from using this material theme is that it has access to a lot of stylings that, again, are going to use across applications. So you may notice that the number was updated now. And so we're able to do that inside the material. By using this art theme, we can set a style on our text view to change that number, use this material theme, and again, we saw that it had colors, shapes, and typography. So we can do that material theme dot typography header 4, and then add in any extra styling we want. And so here we add in that the font weight is now going to be extra bold. And so with that, you get to the final section of this Codelab, which is the finishing touches. And I'm going to leave this for all of you to kind of work through. So this is a section where they give you a couple challenges to make your app a little bit prettier. And so the kind of challenges that we're going to do is we're going to replace our show more, show less button with a little icon to make it take up less space. So we'll do it with this little down and up chevron. And so to do that, you will have to add a new dependency to your Gradle. So you'll open up your app Gradle, add this dependency, sync your entire application, and then you'll be able to change out that button for an icon button. Similarly, you'll want to try out using your string resources. We hard-coded all of our strings in the app, but a good best practice is to actually pull those into your string resources so you can use those across your app and update all your strings across your app. And it's also super important to do for localization, so you're able to change all those strings in and out to different languages for all of your users around the world. And then finally, you'll also look at some other different animations. And so in this case, instead of using extra padding, we're just opening with that extra padding. You'll try to do animate content size and add that to the modifier row. And so after all of that, I do recommend at least trying it on your own, seeing what you can get done. They do offer some final code to see the full application. And with that, congratulations, you have finished this Codelab. Thank you all so much for hanging out here for the last hour and a half. I had a really fun time. I hope you did too. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions or want to contact me, you can find me on Twitter. It's _Sierra O'Brien, so just my name, no spaces. Thank you so much, Madona, for being my host today.
Super amazing work. I know it was intense because it's pretty amazing material, but you did it justice. Like, I mean, I have words. Please, let's see some appreciation for Sierra on the chat session if you loved the session, because I enjoyed the session.
I want to appreciate everyone who stuck around for an hour and a half. I know an hour and a half is a long session to hang out for.
Yeah.
That's a time commitment.
That is a time, and you did great. And I kept wondering, you were so like, you're so patient. I mean, I don't know. I felt like I would definitely like cry sometimes because that was too much.
I only cry during the work day, not on video.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And also, I think I'm going to stop recording this. Good thing we recorded for anybody who wants to watch the session. We'll post it on YouTube. And yeah, so switching off the recording. Yeah, stop.